To discuss, let's bring in Dr Mandel, Director of the Middle East Political Information Network, and also John Sidolidis, a geopolitical strategist at Trilogy Advisors. Welcome to both of you. Eric, Jason Greenblatt, he told the UN Security Council today that UNWRA and UN resolutions are not going to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And let me take his words maybe even one step further and ask you, does the White House think that UN resolutions and UNWRA are part of the problem and not part of the solution?
Whether they think it or not, UNWRA is one of the chief obstacles to peace. This has created a perpetual welfare state. In essence, it has supported Hamas, both physically and also by diverting funds that UNWRA provides, as opposed to Hamas having to provide social services and things like that. And probably worse, it perpetuates the refugee crisis. It means that descendants of refugees in perpetuity are going to be counted. UNWRA counts Palestinians living in Jordan who have citizenship, 2 million of them, as refugees. So there's a craziness about what it is. So UNWRA, if you want peace in this region, the first thing is to dismantle, regardless of what the Trump administration says, this is something that has been needed for a very long time.
Let's get John to weigh in on this. John, do you agree with that? Should UNWRA be completely dismantled and just thrown out here?
I don't know the pace at which UNWRA should be dismantled, but it's a very unfortunate situation, and nobody's suffering more because of all of this than the Palestinian people, who are now in their fourth generation as refugee status. We started out with about 750,000 refugees or displaced persons in 1950, and now we're talking about 5 million aid recipients in Jordan and obviously in the Palestinian territories and elsewhere in the Middle East. And I think what's lacking here really is a Palestinian will to cooperate, to potentially reconcile, to seek out a system for good governance, to provide security for the Palestinian people, to provide them access to power and water and transportation infrastructure so that they have a normal state. But this policy now going back decades of rejecting and resisting has only continued the perpetual misery of the Palestinian people, really more for the self-preservation of the Palestinian leadership. And that's the worst part of all of this.
So what John is just listed are all things that the Trump administration peace plan is going to address, as we're hearing. But this peace plan, from what we know, is going to be speaking in different terms than the traditional terms as the two-state solution based on the 1967 borders used often at the United Nations. Do you think that this paper, the deal of the century, will be as legitimate unless it gets support from the UN or the European Union, these institutions?
I think just the United States as a unipolar superpower in the world, putting something out is going to be very important. I don't expect it to be accepted, but it can be a foundational a document going forward. Basically, the situation, as John alluded to, is that the Palestinians have to start taking responsibility and not be a victim. They can't have their whole narrative be defined by what they don't have or to destroy a Jewish state. And so when they can start caring more about their own people, John is absolutely right, the Palestinian people suffer because of the Palestinian leadership and no preparation for peace.
All right, let's bring John back in. John, Jason Greenblatt also said that it would be a mistake for the Palestinians not to join us, talking about not joining in Bahrain. He said they have nothing to lose and much to gain here, but it is, of course, their choice, he says. However, I mean, we should point out that the Palestinian leadership has had several times, historically, numerous Palestinian leaders have had several options to get almost everything that they've wanted out of peace talks. And as you mentioned before, there's been this history and a pattern of rejection and resistance. Is there any reason to believe that this time will be any different?
I don't know. I mean, no one knows. And, you know, as the U.S. Army likes to remind us, hope is not a strategy. I think it's incumbent upon the U.S., our European partners, and perhaps even major powers, especially a country such as Russia now, which has, for the first time in 4 decades, a major military presence in the Middle East, thanks to its air and naval bases in Syria. But it could play potentially a helpful role here as Trump seeks to cooperate with Putin in areas where they can potentially cooperate. But I think the very important thing here is to look at a little bit of more recent history as well. And even the Obama administration tried with Secretary of State John Kerry, I believe it was in 2013, and he came to the region with a $4 billion economic development plan for the Palestinians. And the day that it was announced, he had, at least apparently, public Israeli and Palestinian support. And the next day, the Palestinian Authority advisor to Mr. Abbas rejected the plan. Just recently, we have the Palestinians. I'm sorry.
No, John, I was about to say, as we're talking about the region, Eric, John, we're hearing some breaking news that U.S. officials say the Pentagon will present plans to the White House to send up to 10,000 more American troops to the Middle East to beef up defenses against potential Iranian threats. Well, the officials say no decision has been made, and it's not clear if the White House will approve sending all or just some of the requested forces. But Eric, what does it tell you?
Well,
are we heading towards a war with Iran?
I actually don't think so. It's not in Iran's interest to have a war at this time. They really would like to wait this out to see if a Democrat wins as president. But I think what people don't realize is that American strength in the region decreases the chance of war. It's American vacuums that have created. American vacuum, after we left after the surge in Iraq, created ISIS to a large degree.
John, in a few words?
No, I don't think the U.S. is planning any type of a military operation, at least as an offensive attack. Of course, we are making very clear that there will be a robust, muscular retaliation or response if Iran provokes the United States, attacks our allies or any U.S. interests. I think this is part of a larger mix to keep Iran completely off balance in the region, because there are so many mixed signals coming from the White House, good and bad, but Iran can't figure out what the Trump policy's next steps look like.
And of course, it's somehow all tied to the peace plan we just talked about before. Eric Mandel, John Sidolidis, stick around with us. Here again with us are Eric Mandel, Director of the Middle East Political Information Network, and John Sidolidis, a geopolitical strategist at Trilogy Advisors. Eric, so last April, in response to the chemical weapons attack in Douma, the United States, along with France and the UK, attacked in Syria. And we all thought maybe this is a new red line, which means Assad probably won't never, ever dare to use chemical weapons again. And if he does, the U.S. will respond again. Do you think we're yet to see another scenario of this kind?
Well, first of all, remember we were promised by the Russians that they got rid of all of their chemical weapons going back 5 years ago.
There's that aspect too.
Okay. The key here is they have used chemical weapons a number of times since then, and it really hasn't raised that many red flags. But because there is this red line, that if they do use them, whether they use them in this time or not, it's important that America respond in some way, because that will be perceived by Iran as weakness. But the real big issue here is Idlib province. Idlib province is a potential catastrophic humanitarian disaster waiting to happen, with millions of refugees. The Turks are involved, the Russians, the Syrians, and Al-Qaeda is the biggest rebel group that's there, an affiliate of theirs. So this is a huge problem, and the Turks have actually reason to be concerned, because millions of refugees could end up into Turkey and overwhelm them.
Now, if in fact, John, let's bring you in. If in fact the U.S. and Britain determined that there was some kind of chemical attack here, chemical usage, which of course we've already been hearing some claims and reports disputing that, but if in fact their investigation showed that there was, how tricky of a situation is this? Because you have Russia so heavily involved in Syria. If there's an airstrike, you would have to think that that's something that Russia would be very adamantly against and would warn against.
I think it depends on the situation. First of all, there likely would be military coordination with Russia, because they've deployed the very powerful, very effective S-400 anti-aircraft missile system in Syria. So anything that would come within that radar range would likely be attacked. And if not, the Russians would then have a major face-saving problem to deal with themselves in terms of credibility in the region. And I can't imagine that Putin would ever give the green light to shoot down a U.S. aircraft over Syria. But let's keep in mind here again, let's look at the recent history. As Eric noted, the U.S. has struck at Syrian assets in the past over crossing that red line. We've also pulverized the Islamic State in eastern Syria. And speaking of Russia, there was a U.S. attack that wiped out several hundred Russian mercenaries in Syria. So President Trump is not looking to engage in any type of major kinetic operations here, but he's made very clear he will use tactical strikes to achieve strategic objectives. And I believe if the State Department does in fact ascertain that there was a major red line crossed, probably will see some type of a serious attack on Syrian assets in the next several days or weeks.
Eric, I want to ask you again about Idlib itself. It's hard to think that Assad is operating there without any green light from the Russians. The Russians, in fact, they helped him bombard sections of Idlib, probably as a result, as reports are claiming, of a previous attack by the Syrian rebels in Idlib over a Russian base. But my question is, do you think that this is just, a particular escalation, or it might deteriorate into this all-out final phase of the Syrian civil war?
Well, I would not say the final phase. There'll be another phase of what's there. This place probably should be divided up. Russian interests and Syrian interests and Iranian interests and Turkish interests are all very different. The Russians really want stability. They have what they want. They have an expanded air base. They have an expanded naval base. The Iranians have a potential for a base there. The Turks are really worried about the refugees. Syria wants to reclaim as much of its territory to put Humpty Dumpty back together again there. And the people who might pay the price here, if there's some quid pro quo, are the Kurds. They may say to the Turks, get out of there. We'll give you northern Syria, to do it ethnically cleanse as you did in Afrin, the Kurds, and we'll find some compromise here.
All right, Eric Mandel, John Sidolides, thank you both so much for your time.